Testing. Can I have the identity of anybody who's on the phone, please?
Doug Triani.
Thank you.
Rose Poston Aon.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, thank you. We'll be beginning in 30 seconds. Okay, just for the record, we do audio and video record our meetings. If I will ask the board to kindly remember to push the button on your microphone when you have something to say on the record and push it again after so that other people can have an opportunity because we only can have 5 active mics at a time. So with that, I will turn it over to Director McGallis and the Finance Committee.
I'd like to call the meeting to order. Would the secretary please call the roll?
Director Anderson?
Here.
Director Buchanan? Director Colson?
Here.
Director DeWitt?
Here.
Director Lewis?
Here.
Director Melvin?
Here.
Director Troiani?
Here.
With the necessary paperwork completed, thank you. Director McGallis?
Here.
We have a quorum of 7 present with 1 absent. If the record would also show that Directors Durante, Fraga, Higgins, Hobson, Pang, Ross, and Chairman Dillard are all also present.
Thank you. Item number 2 is the approval of the minutes for the meeting held April 20, 2017. Are there any questions or comments? If not, could we have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Okay, motion by Director Melvin. I didn't hear the second.
Director Anderson?
Second by Director Lewis. Roll call.
Director Anderson?
Yes.
Director Colson?
Yes.
Director DeWitt?
Yes.
Director Lewis?
Yes.
Director Melvin?
Yes.
Director Troiani?
Yes.
Director McGallis?
Aye.
7 ayes and 1 absent.
Thank you. Item 3A is a presentation of the quarterly performance report. Jill?
Good morning. Wait a second
Morning.
for this to come up. There we go. All right. Good morning again. I will be presenting performance results for the first quarter of 2017. We provide this report on a quarterly basis at the same time that you are reviewing quarterly budget results to certify the service boards are in substantial accordance with their budget. The performance comparisons in this report are to first quarter performance of the prior year, 2016. First, let's look at ridership performance. Using data from the National Transit Database, we can see first quarter ridership trends over the past 15 years. Compared to 2003, which is the first column on this list, 2017 ridership was 2.7 higher. However, for the first quarter 2017, we see ridership decrease of 4.5% compared to 2016. That's a difference of 6.7 million trips. This chart shows RTA system ridership for 2017, represented by the blue bars. The orange dot within each bar represents the peer average ridership performance for that mode. As you can see, each mode had lower ridership figures in comparison to first quarter 2016. Given that 2016 was a leap year with the extra day falling on a workday, we would expect to see a 1% decrease in 2017 if all factors were equal. CTA bus ridership is down 6% compared to 2016, and rail ridership dropped 4%. Bus ridership losses were somewhat better than peer performance, while rail ridership losses were closer to the peer average. Metro ridership was down 1.2% lower than the peer average. Pace Bus showed a 1.7 ridership decrease for the quarter. Even with the decrease, Pace ridership is performing better than its peer average of negative 3.5%. Vanpool experienced steeper losses, ending the first quarter 11.3% below 2016, a much steeper decline compared to its peer average of negative 3%. ADA paratransit ridership decreased by 1.4%, while its peer increased on average 5.1%. Here's a look at the first quarter 2017 peer regional ridership compared to 2016. You can see here this chart shows year-over-year regional ridership using the same peer metropolitan areas that we use in our annual peer review. The Chicago region ranks 6th of the 10 regions with a 4.5% ridership decrease. And you can see from this chart that nearly everyone except for Houston was the only region to see ridership growth at 0.1% compared to 2016. So a decrease in ridership is happening nationally. On this chart, we are looking at a few of the service and financial measures. First quarter performance has some favorable performance for 3 measures shown by green arrows, along with 3 red arrows showing unfavorable performance. There was an increased service provided to customers, as shown the green arrows for vehicle revenue hours and vehicle revenue miles. Regional operating costs, after being adjusted for inflation, were up 2.5%. Higher operating costs were partially offset by the increase in vehicle revenue hours, producing an operating cost per vehicle revenue hour that was 1.4% or $2.38 higher compared to first quarter. The operating cost per passenger trip was $4.68, which is 7.3% or 32 cents unfavorable compared to 2016. This results from the combination of 2 unfavorable inputs, higher operating cost and lower ridership. Fare revenue per passenger trip was up 2.5% or 4 cents and seems to be a positive result. However, both of the inputs for this measure were unfavorable. First quarter fare revenue was down 2.1%, a difference of about $5 million. Ridership, as seen on the previous slide, was down 4.5%. The fare recovery ratio, as shown here, reflects the ratio of fare revenue to operating expenses, without any credits or exclusions. A recovery ratio of 33.6 is 2.3 percentage points lower compared to first quarter 2016, an unfavorable result. This concludes my presentation. Next, B will present the quarterly financial results.
Thank you.
Has joined the conference.
Director Buchanan.
Thank you. Okay, Director Buchanan has joined the committee. Are there any questions or comments about the report? One of the things that I know, Jill, we talked about at a meeting you and I were at recently was the potential impact that Uber's having and Lyft and programs like that. I mean, you see the van pools dropping off and bus rides dropping off, and you see it happening nationally. What kind of information do we have on what that impact really is and how we should be dealing with it? Because locally, in Lake County, for example, a lot of people are starting to use that, and it's having an impact, and either we need to realign our business or get out of some of it if it's going to be that big of an impact, as I believe it is.
Yeah, exactly. I think everyone's aware that it's happening. I think the challenge is we haven't quite figured out how to measure it. We do have some surveys that happened in the first part of the year that maybe will reveal some of that data. But I think that's the big challenge that I think we need to focus on, is how to measure that. It's also a challenge because of those TNCs, the Ubers and Lyfts. They don't share their data. So that's the other challenge. But I think that's the next phase that we need to figure out, is exactly why this is happening and what the effect is, and if we need to make changes as a result.
Thank you.
Can I,
Mr. Chairman?
piggyback on that? I talked to Leanne this week, and I had a long conversation with T.J. Ross at PACE about this particular issue, the Uber experience and others. And they are very much aware, Director McGallis, in looking at these trends, including, and I was very heartened to hear Director Ross say, we are looking to revitalize, revamp, think outside of the box where we can become as competitive or have a better model than Uber. So they have a number of ideas, Ike, that they're working on. Uber is not necessarily the solution. There are, especially if you're taking senior citizens who a lot of times don't have iPhones. But I know PACE is looking at, doing a number of things that are innovative to change those numbers, and most importantly, to better and more safely serve the kinds of customers, unique customers that they have. Many are people with disabilities and senior citizens. So they're very much aware of this. In fact, Leanne, maybe we should have, we should have Pace come in at one of our meetings this summer and just talk about it. But they're very much on top of this. They're very much trying to think outside of the box. They're surveying other peer types of systems nationally. And, Director Ross, while Uber is generally a good partner with ours, has some concerns about their ability to really meet our region's needs. But they're looking at it, and most importantly, I was happy to hear they have some pretty innovative ideas that they thought about in terms of how to serve that population.
Great, thank you. Any other comments? Yes, Director Lewis.
I know we put a lot of emphasis on marketing and advertising. My question is, and it maybe piggybacks off the chairman's question or statement, as we look at other markets, are there any best practices outside of marketing and advertising that seem to have impacted demand? Because it seems like there's not a tight correlation between increased marketing and advertising and increasing the demand for ridership. There seems to be other factors that are more tightly correlated to that. So anything we've learned from talking to our national peers that might give us some insight as to what we might do?
Right. So one thing I should have said initially too, so as part of our ongoing strategic planning process, this is an issue that we're trying to dig very deeply into in conjunction with the service board so we can kind of figure it out as best as possible and to try to make some changes as a result of that. I would say nationally, there's a lot of experimentation that's happening. I think we're watching that closely to see what is working and what is not and what we can adapt to the Chicago region. I think we'll kind of continue to do that. So kind of between those two things of trying to put the strategic plan together, understanding what the trends are and where the markets are changing, I think hopefully we'll come to some conclusion where we can at least focus on certain places where we think we could make changes that will affect ridership.
Is demographics, because, as millennials become more part of our community and baby boomers begin to not become as big a part, is that something we're putting into the equation?
Absolutely. Yeah, the demographic shifts are a huge thing. Aging population, millennial population. We have a loss of population overall in the region. So, yes, all of those things.
Yes.
Not
Dr.
on the
Pang.
committee, but for your comments, Chairman, Pace should look at something called GoGo Grandparents that's launched, which uses a lot of share ride, but it's geared towards an elderly population and disabled population, and it has an IVR phone response and an operator and double vetting and people that will help you to and from the car with your packages. So, the issue is in the private sector, they can respond to this need so fast. And it's a little more, they're making it a little more affordable, particularly if you're willing to do a pool. So it's, and it taps into the Uber and Lyfts and others, but it's called GoGo Grandparents.
Yeah, I
Growing
will
very fast.
send a note to TJ today. That's good to know. Just one other comment on these numbers. There's another story about population loss today in the papers that's out there. And there is no doubt that some of our regional population loss impacts these numbers. But I will tell anyone, without mass transit and our ability to keep millennials especially in the central business district, South Loop, with Near West Loop, hopefully development coming with the revitalization of the old post office in Union Station. Another announcement by Amtrak today. I woke up to it on Union Station. But without mass transit, those numbers would be a lot worse. But population loss clearly impacts these numbers, but the numbers would be much greater without us. We are actually a counter factor to population loss, and we counter with the kinds of workers and people you want living in metropolitan Chicago, ones that have jobs and ones that have good jobs, and that millennial workforce, which is going to have to take care of us when we are aging baby boomers, Director Pang. So, thank you.
I think, Mr. Chairman, I think you are on to something here, and it was a comment I was going to make because we do have ongoing population loss, and this isn't the first year it's happened. And so people are moving to different places, and so it does make you stop and pause and say, have we adjusted our service levels in anticipation of, well, I guess, in response to the loss we've had to date and in anticipation of what we think is going to happen going forward. And I that's a challenge that is a difficult one and a political one, but important in the sustainability of our system.
Okay, no other questions, comments? We'll move on to item 4A, which is resolution certifying the financial results for the first quarter of 2017. B?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Today we review the year-to-date financial results for the first quarter of 2017, which are subject to board certification. A comprehensive written report of the year-to-date financial performance results was distributed earlier. The Service Board's year-to-date financial results for the first quarter were mixed. Unfavorable ridership and the potential reduction of state funding for reduced fare reimbursement has negatively impacted operating revenue, but solid expense performance led by lower fuel costs and a mild winter has driven favorable operating deficits for the region. At the end of the presentation, I will be recommending that the board certify that the results of the operations of each service board are in substantial accordance with the adopted 2017 budget. However, I will also be recommending that the board find the region as a whole to be not in substantial accordance with the budget. As I will explain later, the potential reduction of the reduced fare funding from the state is literally making all the difference with respect to the performance of our recovery ratios. This important funding partially offsets service board fare revenue resulting from mandatory reduced fare programs. The state stopgap spending plan passed by the legislature on June 30th, 2016 appropriated only $17.5 million of reduced fare funding for state fiscal year 2017 instead of the normal level of $34 million. While we are still within state fiscal year 2017, I will refer to this funding reduction as potential rather than actual, since it could still substantially potentially be restored. During the first quarter, Chicago area employment increased by 17,000 jobs, but the workforce shrank by nearly 33,000. As a result, the regional unemployment rate improved by 0.6 percentage points, dropping to 4.6. This level slightly lags the national rate by 0.1%. Regional and national unemployment rates have been trending back to pre-recession levels. However, the regional decline in the unemployment rate has been driven by a reduction in our labor force rather than new job growth. Now let's look at year-to-date system ridership, which was 2.6% lower than budget through the first quarter, as shown by the orange bars on the chart. System ridership continues to show a consistent decline compared to 2016. As we saw in the quarterly performance report presentation earlier, Chicago ridership performance ranks 6 out of the 10 major transit systems. Factors impacting ridership include lower gas prices, a shrinking workforce. Returning to the ridership summary, CTA year-to-date ridership was 2.9% under budget and 5.1% lower than 2016. Bus ridership has decreased by 6% this year, and even rail ridership is down by 4%. Metro ridership was essentially at budget, but lower than prior year, as customers continue to respond to the 2017 fare increase and sustain lower gas prices. Pace Suburban Service ridership, highlighted in red, finished the quarter 4.7% unfavorable to budget and 2.4% lower than 2016. Regional ADA paratransit ridership, also highlighted in red, finished the quarter 5.1% unfavorable to budget. Looking at system operating revenue, that was $9.2 million unfavorable to budget due to a combination of unfavorable fare revenue and the 48% lower level of reduced fare funding provided by the state stopgap spending plan. Specifically, $4.2 million of the total unfavorable variance was due to the lower reduced fare reimbursement funding, with the remaining $5 million due to fare and other revenue shortfalls. Looking at CTA's operating revenue, this was $7.8 million, or 4.9% unfavorable to budget, which is highlighted in red, due to the shortfalls again in the fare revenue and state reduced fare funding. PACE Suburban Service operating revenue was $1.2 million or 8.4% unfavorable to budget, highlighted in red, again due to shortfalls in fare revenue, state reduced fare reimbursement funding, and other income. ADA paratransit operating revenue was $0.4 million or 11.2% unfavorable, also highlighted in red due to shortfalls in fare revenue, delayed Medicaid reimbursement, and lower reimbursements for RTA certification trips. So now looking at public funding, that shows unfavorable to budget results due to slowing sales tax growth, which has been sluggish over the past year. Year-to-date public funding growth through March is about 4% below budget, with unfavorable real estate transfer tax receipts, state tax sales tax performance, and PTF revenue. Remember, PTF is 30% of the sales tax revenue, so it's directly tied to sales tax performance. The reasons for the public funding slowdown are not entirely clear, but certainly the recent population losses, surging online sales are not helpful. We'll continue to monitor the economic trends and monthly public funding results from the state. On a slightly brighter note, system-wide operating expenses through March were $12.8 million or 1.9% favorable to budget, with each service board reporting favorable year-to-date results. PACE Suburban Service had a 3.8 favorable to budget expense performance, highlighted in light blue, driven primarily by administration savings. At the regional level, favorable operating expenses were not strong enough to offset the unfavorable operating revenue and public funding, producing a year-to-date net result for the first quarter that was $10.7 million unfavorable to budget. Metro and PACE each had favorable net result variances compared to budget due to good expense performance and also, in the case of Metro, favorable operating revenue. CTA and ADA paratransit had unfavorable net results due to declining fare revenue and the shortfall of the reduced fare reimbursement. So now let's look at the regional system-generated revenue recovery ratio of 45.9%. This was 0.6 percentage points unfavorable to budget through the first quarter. Metro's recovery ratio was favorable to budget, while CTA, PACE, and ADA paratransit were each unfavorable. On the left, the fare recovery ratio of 33.6% includes only passenger fare revenue, and that actually is an improvement from last month. While ancillary service board revenue, when ancillary service board revenue is included, the recovery ratio increases to 38.8% through March, labeled as all revenue in the table, also improved from last month. Focusing on the certification of year-to-date results through the first quarter, this slide shows the variances of each service board's operating deficit from the budget. The operating deficit is calculated by subtracting operating expenses from operating revenue and does not consider public funding results. Metro and PACE each had a favorable variance in the operating deficit, while CTA and ADA paratransit's operating deficits were essentially at budget. The combined regional operating deficit was $3.7 million, or 0.9% unfavorable. The variance in operating deficit from budget is the primary metric that the RTA staff uses to gauge substantial accordance with budget. Because the service boards were able to offset revenue shortfalls with lower expenses during the first quarter, the operating deficit of each service board was either favorable to budget or well within the 5% unfavorable variance threshold defined in our guide for substantial accordance. However, there is an important secondary criteria for substantial accordance: the status of the regional recovery ratio. The regional recovery ratio was 0.6 percentage points unfavorable to budget for the first quarter. It would have been 0.1 percentage points favorable to budget had the service boards accrued the full amount of the reduced fare reimbursement funding, rather than the 48% lower level contained in the state stopgap budget plan. That is why I stated earlier that the potential loss of the RFR is making all the difference with our recovery ratio performance. The first quarter results suggest that RTA Region may finish 2017 with a recovery ratio of under the 50% statutory requirement. If that happens, the RTA requires that the RTA and the service boards to return PTF funding to the state in the amount of the revenue shortfall below 50%. And I wanted to give you an example. 1 percentage point miss for the region will require the return of $23.2 million of PTF. Assuming each service board would miss by 1 percentage point, the amounts that would be owed back would be CTA 13.4 million, Metra 7.4 million, and PACE 2.4 million. But given the unique circumstances of the first quarter, it is our staff's recommendation to find each service board's results in substantial accordance with budget, but the region as a whole not in substantial accordance, thereby formally documenting the impact of the potential loss of RFR while we still are within the state fiscal year 2017. The RFR is structured as a grant from the state DOT to the RTA, although it is fully passed on to the service boards. Staff currently views its potential reduction as a region-level problem, eliciting a region-level funding solution of not in substantial accordance rather than the service board level funding. Staff further believes it would be premature and somewhat unfair to find an individual service board not in substantial accordance with the budget for the first quarter due to the potential funding loss. So we are sounding a bell but not pulling the fire alarm. In our continued efforts in Springfield to restore this critical funding, efforts in Springfield to restore this critical funding are unsuccessful as we move out of state fiscal year 2017 in July, our view of this funding loss would evolve from potential to an actual one. In the meantime, we are pursuing a multi-pronged approach, seeking recovery ratio relief through legislative action, initiating discussions with the service boards about action plans, and keeping our board of directors apprised of any development. That concludes our remarks. I will be happy to answer any questions. Keep in mind that we thought about this long and hard. We thought of actually, since it is a 0.6% offset, we actually thought of finding the region in substantial accordance. But we thought, given the ridership loss and the stagnant growth in sales tax and the PTF tied into that, that it would be better to make sure that we were very transparent and made it clear that we are very concerned about this, but we still think that, again, our guidance document, which we developed a few years ago when there was substantial discussion about what it meant to be in substantial accordance or not, while not adopted by the board, it was worked on with the 3 CFOs and the RTA, drafting the language. It was presented to this body, and we basically said this is what we're going to use because it shouldn't depend on who's the CFO here or who the CFOs are at the various service boards. We wanted to say this is the document that we're going to use because people wanted us to define what it means to be in substantial accordance, and it had been, it had meant different things to different people over the years. So we wanted to use that as our guide. We distributed it again with your board packet so that you have reference. And we could have gone really either way, but we just wanted to be upfront and say, look, we're concerned about this. We don't want to come to you mid-year and say suddenly, here we are, we have a problem, so you're aware of it. So certainly open to any questions.
Thank you. Certainly finding the region in noncompliance, I think, is the appropriate thing to do because it's a heads up. And like I know both Leanne and you have been meeting with the service boards staff to keep an eye on what's going on, and until we know what the state ultimately does with the budget, that's an $18 million swing in the reimbursement as well. And the first quarter is always a time to take a look at it, but even as the policies that were dated 9/10/14, or the draft, I should say, that we utilize, it's well within the range of that document to take the action that you're taking with the service boards and with us. Are there any other questions or comments? If not, yes, Director Colson.
Yeah, B, you provided me, this is all based on the reduced fare reimbursement from the state. Is that the crux of the problem here? And you at my request, gave me a list of 12 different reduced or free fares that are presently in effect, only 3 of which are mandated by law. And I'm thinking, as an alternative perhaps to fare increases, to get up to 50%, can't we take a look at some of these reduced fare programs, especially in view of the state's inability or unwillingness to reimburse us for it? Why are we giving free rides if the state's not willing to reimburse us? Isn't that a place to look, among others?
I agree. I think everything should be explored, and that certainly is one of them, along with other strategic kinds of things. Yes, I agree.
Other questions or comments? If not, we have a motion.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes, Director Hobson.
Yes. Do you have any feel for the likelihood of the state reversing and reimbursing for the reduced fare?
No, I don't. I basically know what you know. Certainly, we continue to include it because why would we self-cut?
Right.
And certainly that was the agreement among the service boards. But as you can see, we're only accruing it at half. So that's, again, an intent to be maybe more realistic. We are still hoping for it to be restored, but, I don't have any further information.
And are there any discussions in Springfield about, instead of reimbursing us, at least giving the service boards credit towards the fare box recovery as far as the reduced fare reimbursement?
That is certainly something we would like pursued. I don't know if Jeremy's not here. So we
Yeah,
have
that
to-
is one of the absolute option. That is one of the options that's on the table for further discussion. But again, they won't really begin in earnest until we know what happens post Wednesday. I mean, after Wednesday next week, we'll kind of pretty much know what the end game is, at least for this year's, the state's fiscal year for this year. So then we can pursue any other relief or credit, and that'll be part of that sort of multi-pronged approach that B talked about, legislative side of things.
One of the conditions in the, and I appreciate you sending out the substantially in accordance guidelines, so thank you for doing that. One of the items listed in there are any unforeseen conditions that are having a material negative impact on established budget. Certainly, reduced fare would cover that. We didn't foresee that they would stop paying the reduced fare, so isn't that a material negative impact on our established budget, and therefore wouldn't that drive us to say that the service boards are not substantially in compliance?
That's a condition, but the primary focus is whether or not the first criteria is whether or not they're in that range, and that would be the number one item. And then certainly what are contributory causes, we would consider those. But the first point of decision is whether or not they are, within that 5% range of the recovery ratio projection. Operating deficit, I should say. And then we'd look at what the criteria is on that. So no, we would not just pull that as a separate criteria to evaluate.
Okay, so I think we're walking a fine line here as where we are. So given that we're walking the fine line, and this is not please don't take this as a disparaging remark against the service boards. I think the service boards have done a phenomenal job in terms of maintaining operating costs and dealing with adverse conditions that are being thrown at them by the state. But are the service boards actively preparing contingency plans, corrective action plans at this point in time?
I wouldn't disagree that it is a fine line, and that's exactly why we found, the region this way. I could have gone the other way, but I wanted to make sure that we were very transparent. They are always preparing. I mean, you see their expenses. They're trying to keep their expenses in line. I know CTA is a little bit, but, it's really not significant. I think that they are always preparing, as you know, as part of our business plan call every year. We require them to have fund balance reserve policy, since we no longer fund to budget, and we no longer fund to budget, and we no longer have a reserve, a fund balance reserve for the region at the RTA. They are required to do that. So those are two significant changes, as well as we are constantly in touch to relay what is going on with the Public Transportation Fund, and as you know, we're at our cap with short-term borrowing. So they're looking at that as well. So they know they are preparing. They know that they've got to increase system-generated revenue. They know that they've got to curtail their expenses. They know that we're going to be preparing the 2018 business plan call, and all of that is part of their preparation. So yes, they always are.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, Director Lewis. Director Miller.
A couple of questions and a couple of comments. I happen to know that CTA is looking at other revenue enhancement issues and sort of a part of a plan to look at things. Is there seasonality in these numbers?
These are already adjusted for seasonality. When we put together the recovery ratios, when we put together ridership projections, they are already adjusted for seasonality. But, you know, summer periods, sometimes they peak, right? We still have some of this was the winter period, but, you know, it was a mild winter, so
Right.
they are adjusted
Right.
for seasonality.
So in conversations with CTA, they feel that they're about right where they expect it to be, and they expect that, you know, the seasonality will carry them a little bit in the fall. And that's sort of
They're watching it very closely. I can't say that. They're watching it very closely as well.
The other thing is, you know, with all the free rides that CTA provides, if CTA were to get a credit for the $100 million or so in free rides that it gets, I think you'd have very different numbers.
That's absolutely correct.
And so that's perhaps where we should focus, rather than sort of walk down another road. It looks like, you know, fare increases or something like that, and we disrupt people's budgets in an area where people are already leaving town. Maybe it doesn't sound like such a good idea. So I think that's a more important issue.
I think it's a multi-pronged approach. I think you've got to look at all of that, you know.
Thank you.
Director Lewis. Knitting, okay. Director
Question.
Higgins.
The two of the potential remedies here are, of course, requesting an amended budget or action plan from the service boards. Does that process, is there a reason that that process has to happen at the conclusion of a quarter when we conduct this substantial accordance analysis, or could it happen at any monthly meeting of the RTA?
There's no requirement for any particular time frame. We just like to see, you know, I mean, doing a budget amendment is a significant amount of work, both for the service boards and for this board, to get that all passed and so forth. Doing revised projections on sales tax, all of that, we seek out, customized sales tax projection. All of that can be done any time of the year, but we want to make sure that it's needed before we go out and have the service boards do all that work and so forth and get it passed through this board. So typically, I remember you did one, I think, in 2012. I was just new here. And I know that it took 2 or 3 meetings to get that passed. So that was not a small feat, and I think it was for CTA and for PACE at the time, or PACE ADA. Yeah. And I think one passed and one didn't, and it was a lot of drama. But I think that certainly it's something that's appropriate mid-year. And, it doesn't have to be mid-year, but I'd want to see what another quarter looks like.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? One of the things that stands out on the different charts was the fact that Metro, that they did raise their fares, and they, we just kind of skip over it. They took some criticism at that point in time, and yet with the reduced public funding that's going, that Metro's not getting at this point, somewhat reduced ridership over 2016, they have a solid budget, hitting their budget marks, and I think that's a compliment to them. And I think they bit the bullet and did the right thing, and it now is reflected in these numbers. Any other questions or comments? Sure.
B, could you share with the board what you gave Director Colson with respect to the free and reduced rides charts? Just so
Certainly.
we have that, including which 3 are mandated and which 3 are not.
Yeah, it's pretty comprehensive. We put together that there's, we'll happily share that with the board.
Right.
Great. Director Lewis. Melvin, I'm sorry. Director.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Metro's to be, complimented for doing the right thing and the brave thing. I think that, CTA's got a slightly different mission, and CTA's job is to keep the fares low. I think they're in the middle of the pack. Is that right? When you look at their peers across the country, yes. So it's not like they're cheap or it's not like they're expensive. The job is to make Chicago and the region an attractive place for businesses to come. The other part is that if you start thinking about raising fees, you've got a lot of neighborhoods in the area that have never really recovered from the recession, and so these are people that you want to get into the mainstream economy, something Chairman Gates used to talk quite a bit about. And so, it gets in the way of that. So I think that the approach that CTA has taken, which is to find revenue enhancement opportunities through advertisement and other ways, is really the right approach. And that raising fares at CTA should be the last thing that we consider. Certainly way ahead of that, if CTA can get credit for the $100 million worth of free rides it gives, these numbers will jump by 3%. You won't have any problem for quite a while. Now that's really the issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, we have a motion to approve in a second. Motion by Director Colson, second by Director DeWitt. Roll call.
Director Anderson?
Yes.
Director Buchanan?
Yes.
Director Colson? Yes. Director DeWitt?
Yes.
Director Lewis?
Yes.
Director Melvin?
Yes.
Director Troiani?
Yes.
Director McGallis?
Aye.
8 ayes.
Thank you. Item 4B is a discussion and ordinance releasing the 2018 business plan call. B.
Bill Lackman, our budget and treasurer, will be presenting the business plan call for 2018.
Good morning,
Morning.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Finance Committee, and members of the Board of Directors. This morning, I am seeking board approval to release the business plan call kicking off the 2018 budget and capital programming process. The business plan call outlines for the service boards the elements required for the development of their operating budgets, 2-year financial plans, and 5-year capital programs. The annual business planning process begins today in May and culminates in December with board adoption of the service board budgets and capital programs. In 2017, our regional business plan included an annual budget of $3 billion and a 5-year capital program of $5.1 billion. These amounts clearly merit careful and deliberate planning. The business plan call lays out the business planning process in detail. Through the summer and fall, the RTA and the service boards will work together through each step, leading to an adopted 2018 regional budget and 5-year capital program. We're not going to paint a rosy picture for 2018, which already appears will be a very challenging budget year. As we discussed during the presentation of the Service Board financial results, sales tax growth has slowed significantly after 6 consecutive years of 4% or higher growth. This alone will limit the capacity of the Service Board's expense growth in 2018. Moreover, we have experienced worsening delays in the receipt of state funding for operations and debt service from a state without an approved budget. As presented earlier this morning, RTA system ridership declined for the 4th consecutive year in 2016, consistent with a national trend of decreasing transit ridership. Lower ridership means less fare revenue, which creates pressure on the individual service board recovery ratios and the statutory 50% recovery ratio requirement. As you are all well aware, capital funding at the federal level continues to fall well short of our annual capital needs, and the state lacks any capital funding plan at all. The key components of the business plan call are shown here. The regional economic outlook is the basis for the sales tax forecast used to set funding levels for the service boards. The service boards examine their individual transportation markets and develop service plans that address the needs and opportunities of those markets. The business plan call provides sample schedules of information that the RTA is requesting. This information includes revenues and expenses by category, recovery ratios, staffing levels, service plans, operating statistics, and the financial parameters for any planned bond issuances. These schedules are meant to serve as guides the service boards can submit their information in the formats that they use in their own budget process. Our goal is to obtain consistent information across the service boards so that we can present aggregated regional data to you. For the capital program, the service boards will provide descriptions of new projects, identifying the funding sources that will support them. Through the business planning process, we will learn more about the issues addressed by each service board so that we can better understand the assumptions underlying their budgets and capital programs. This enables us to provide sufficient information for you, the board, to ensure that the business plans apply resources efficiently and effectively and promote the long-term financial viability of the region's public transit system. A few new items of note for 2018. In response to service board feedback, the deadline for the submission of the proposed budgets and capital programs to the RTA has been rescheduled from September 30th to October 12th. That is, after the service board's October board meetings. This later deadline may require an adjustment to the RTA's public hearing schedule, which we are discussing here internally. Updates to the service board's fund balance and reserve plans are due at the same time the service boards submit their proposed budgets and capital programs. Due to the new federal regulations, all transit agencies must develop their own transit asset management plan. They must articulate their methodology for prioritization of capital projects based on such criteria as ridership, operating cost impacts, and asset condition. Listed before you are the 7 criteria for budget adoption identified in the RTA Act. Revenues and expenses in balance. Cash flow sufficient to pay expenses with reasonable promptness. Operating budgets that meet the recovery ratio requirements, are based on reasonable and prudent assumptions, and follow sound financial principles. Business plans that not only meet the financial, budgetary, and fiscal requirements set by the RTA Board, but that are also consistent with the goals and objectives of the Regional Transit Strategic Plan. The capital program for each service board identifies the projects to be undertaken in the 2018 through 2022 program period with projected funding levels. For each new project in the program, the service boards will outline the scope, evaluation criteria, justification, benefits, and costs. The RTA also requests that the service boards provide preliminary estimates of additional capital funding from local sources, service board funds, and service board bond proceeds planned for the 5-year capital program. To meet the requirements of federal and state law and to provide opportunities for public input, the business plan calendar includes several public meetings and presentations on the capital program development process. I'll now close with a summary of the 2018 business plan timeline. As I mentioned, today I am seeking board approval for the release of the 2018 business plan call. In July, the RTA will provide to the service boards preliminary estimates of funding levels as a basis for discussions with the service board budget teams. On August 24th, we will present the proposed funding amounts and recovery ratios to the RTA board for consideration. Setting the funding amounts in August gives the service boards more time to complete their proposed business plans before submitting them to the RTA by October 12th and presenting them at public hearings in October and November. September 15th is the statutory date for the adoption of the funding amounts and recovery ratios. November 15th is the statutory date for meeting the service board's statutory date for the service boards to submit their adopted budgets to the RTA. On November 29th, the Finance Committee meeting the Finance Committee will hold a special meeting to review the service board budgets. Finally, on December 14th, we will present to you the consolidated regional budget for adoption. That concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Questions or comments? Director Lewis.
Mr. Chairman, I guess I would say, and this is maybe more of a statement, given the gravity of some of the issues we've talked about in terms of reduced funding, changes in demand, expenses, et cetera, I wouldn't expect to see the service boards come back with just a very small alteration of their budget. I would expect to see some major changes in terms of what they're going to do to either reflect the demand curve shifting, to reflect the fact that they need to raise revenues, and perhaps that might require some looking at the cost side, or the cost that we charge to riders, but to take a comprehensive look at the overall situation, because the issues that we've talked about this morning are very serious issues, and without serious steps taken now, there's no way we can really kind of expect to get out of this morass anytime soon. So it's more of a statement saying that the budget process this year is taking on real serious implications, and I would expect that we'd see the service boards reacting accordingly. Not that they haven't before, but just given the gravity of these issues, we can't expect to do a very small change and get a different outcome.
Any, Director Hobson?
One of the responsibilities that we have here at the RTA is to set the recovery ratio for the service boards. We earlier had prepared a schedule showing the recovery ratios year over year. I think it started in 2010, and it has been steadily declining. Last year, I think we picked up a couple of tenths. Will we continue that trend to restore, and when do we indicate that we do want higher fare box recovery ratios?
Well, it's always a negotiation, you know that, and it was very tough to get some of the negotiations through last year, and we were able to get PACE to come up, I think it was 0.3, and remember CTA is already at 54, and that was negotiated a few years ago. So it is a tough negotiation, and they realize we'd rather it not be so tight, you know, because it is very tight. But it is a negotiation. Yes, we'll continue to have those discussions, but ultimately we do have to get regional agreement and a regional budget passed. And if you recall, a few years ago, even though CTA's recovery ratio, and they agreed to it, was higher, in turn, they received other things that they were looking for as part of the negotiation. So we were fortunate that we got them to come up a little bit, but budgets are very tight, so there's reluctancy to go up much higher.
Certainly, I understand that. But if our going in position of staff is we're not going to go any higher, well, we're definitely not going to get anything higher. So I want to ensure that RTA staff has a going in position that, yes, we would like to see strengthening.
That has never been our position, Dr. Rose.
Well, I just want to make sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? If not, can we have a motion and a second? Motion by Director Melvin, second by Director Lewis. Roll call.
Director Anderson?
Yes.
Director Buchanan?
Yes.
Director Colson? Yes. Director DeWitt?
Yes.
Director Lewis?
Yes.
Director Melvin?
Yes.
Director Troiani?
Yes.
Director McGallis?
Aye.
8 ayes.
Thank you. Any other items to come before the committee? If not, a motion to adjourn by Director Melvin, second by Director Colson. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Nays? Ayes have it. Committee's adjourned. Thank you.
All right, we will move right along into the regular